He slammed his fist into the steering wheel, rage boiling over a missing shipment and a traitor who needed to bleed, until the red light forced him to stop and look across the rain-soaked street. There stood the woman he'd buried years ago, alive, selling cheap umbrellas in the storm, with a little boy strapped to her chest, whose sapphire blue eyes were an exact copy of his own. In that frozen second, Lorenzo Luca realized everything he believed was a lie, and someone was about to pay in blood. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And Happy New Year to every single one of you. Let's start this year with a story that will keep you glued till the very end. Somewhere on the rain-drowned eastern coast, at an intersection where the storm turned every streetlight into a hazy blur, Lorenzo Luca drove his fist into the leather steering wheel of his black sedan. The sound was dull and brutal, swallowed immediately by the silence pressing against the tinted windows. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. His jaw locked so tight it ached. A shipment had gone missing. A traitor had surfaced inside his organization. And in Lorenzo's world, betrayal had only one answer: blood. The red traffic light burned through the downpour like an accusation, casting harsh shadows across the sharp lines of his face, turning his dark eyes into something colder than steel. Then the world stopped. The hiss of rain against glass, the low hum of the engine, the static murmur of the radio, all of it dissolved into a single, suffocating moment. Because there, across the street, beneath a flickering street lamp and a curtain of relentless rain, stood a woman holding a bundle of bright, rain-battered umbrellas. Her hair hung in wet tangles against her pale cheeks. The dim glow caught her face, gaunt and exhausted, and Lorenzo recognized her instantly. She was not a stranger. She was Emma Watson, his ex-wife, the woman he had buried 5 years ago after a warehouse fire that left him gutted and half-mad with grief. And now she stood there, alive, rain soaking through her thin jacket, and strapped to her chest was a baby in a yellow raincoat. A baby who turned its small face toward the car, revealing eyes so achingly familiar they stopped Lorenzo's heart cold. His own eyes, sapphire blue. Everything Lorenzo had built, every truth he had carved into stone, every ghost he had locked away, shattered in silence. The empire he commanded, the fear he wielded, the violence he had perfected, all of it meant nothing now, because the woman he loved had not died, and the child in her arms bore his unmistakable face. The rain hammered harder, as if the sky itself recoiled from what was unfolding. The cold inside the car sharpened until Lorenzo's breath fogged the glass. He stared at her through the storm, the red light cutting into him like broken glass. He did not believe in ghosts. But here she was, flesh, bone, breath, holding a child he had never known existed. His chest tightened, crushing the air from his lungs. All he could hear was the rain and the violent pounding of his own pulse. Emma did not see him. She bent down, smoothing the baby's damp hair, whispering something soft, before straightening again and offering an umbrella to a passerby. Her movements were still gentle, still unmistakably hers, but her shoulders were too thin, her eyes stripped of the fire they once held. She had been running. That much was obvious. But from whom? From him, or from something darker lurking in the world he ruled? Lorenzo could not move. Every muscle in his body had turned to stone. He wanted to throw open the door, cross the street, pull her into his arms, and demand answers to the 100 questions tearing through his mind. But he remained frozen, because what he felt first was not relief. It was fear. A sensation Lorenzo Luca had not permitted himself to feel in years. Fear of the truth. Fear that if she was alive and had not returned to him, the reason must be something so unbearable he could not survive knowing it. The driver beside him leaned closer and whispered, "Green light, boss." But Lorenzo did not answer, did not turn his head, did not blink. His gaze clung to the woman across the street, as if looking away would make her vanish again. And then, in a voice roughened by rage, pain, and something deeper than despair, he spoke a single word: drive. The car moved forward, slicing through the rain, leaving behind the intersection and the fragile image of a woman clutching rain-soaked umbrellas and a child with his unmistakable sapphire eyes. Lorenzo sat rigid in the back seat, his hand still gripping the door handle, as if releasing it would send him running back into the storm, screaming her name. But he did not. Not because he lacked the will, but because he lacked the courage. For 5 long years, he had lived like a man already dead. His soul buried with Emma. The night flames consumed the warehouse, leaving behind only a blackened ring and a pile of unidentifiable ash. He had held that ring, knelt in the rain at her grave, and roared like a wounded animal into the empty silence. He had withdrawn from everything resembling humanity, rebuilt himself into something harder, colder, unrecognizable even to the man he used to be. No longer the man who knew how to hope, to trust, to love. Only the ruthless sovereign of the eastern coast underworld. But now, with a single glimpse through the rain, everything he had believed to be true began to fracture. Emma was alive. And she had a child who, if he was not mistaken, could not be older than 5. Lorenzo closed his eyes, trying to smother the storm rising in his chest. Impossible. This was impossible. Either the world had gone mad, or he had lived for years inside a lie constructed with terrifying precision. The driver, silent for most of the ride, glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, but said nothing. He was used to his boss's unpredictable rages, but this silence unsettled him more than any explosion ever had. Lorenzo slowly opened his eyes. Outside, the city blurred into watercolor behind sheets of rain. His voice came out low and rasped. "Where is Marco?" The driver hesitated before answering. "At headquarters. Want me to call him?" "No." Lorenzo turned his face back toward the window. He no longer saw the streets, only Emma and the boy. Every image cut like shattered glass. The way she touched the child's hair, the way the boy clung to her side. Those eyes, his eyes, cold, deep, always searching. It was no accident. It could not be coincidence. That was his blood. Theirs. Emma had not died, had not burned the way he believed. And that child was his son. Lorenzo arrived at headquarters like a man walking through water. The towering steel and glass building loomed above him, cold and impersonal. A monument to the empire he had built on violence and control. But tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. The rain had followed him here, drumming against the pavement, soaking into his expensive suit as he stepped out of the sedan. He barely noticed. His bodyguards moved toward him immediately, their faces tight with concern. "Boss, we need to discuss the shipment." Lorenzo walked past them as if they were ghosts. His lieutenants waited in the marble lobby, suits pristine, expressions grave, ready to brief him on the betrayal that had consumed his morning. He did not look at them, did not acknowledge their presence. His driver called after him, something about security protocols, about the meeting scheduled in 20 minutes. Lorenzo kept walking, up the elevator, down the corridor, into his office. The door closed behind him with a heavy, final sound, sealing him inside the silence. He stood there in the dark, rain streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights bleeding through the glass like old wounds. His reflection stared back at him, a man he no longer recognized. Wet, hollow, fractured. He pulled off his jacket and let it fall to the floor. His hands were shaking. Lorenzo Luca's hands never shook. But they did now, because Emma was alive. The thought circled his mind like a vulture, picking at every memory he had locked away. He moved to the bar and poured himself a drink, whiskey splashing over the rim of the glass. He downed it in one burning gulp, but it did nothing to silence the roar in his head. He poured another, drank it, poured a third, and then he stopped, gripping the edge of the bar until his knuckles went white, because the memories were coming whether he wanted them or not. He met Emma on a summer night 6 years ago, at a charity gala he had no business attending. She was a volunteer coordinator, laughing with a group of donors, her dress simple and cream-colored, her smile brighter than anything in that room full of diamonds and lies. He should have walked away. Men like him did not belong near women like her. But he didn't walk away. He crossed the room, introduced himself, and within 5 minutes, she had made him laugh, something he had not done in years. Within 5 weeks, he was in love. Within 5 months, they were married. Emma had been his light in a world built on shadows. She never asked what he did, never questioned the men who surrounded him, or the late-night calls that pulled him away. She simply loved him, fiercely and completely, as if she could see past the blood on his hands to the man he had been before the empire consumed him. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo felt human. And then the warehouse fire happened. It was supposed to be a routine meeting. Emma had insisted on coming with him that night, wanting to see where he worked, to understand his world. He had tried to talk her out of it, but she had smiled that stubborn smile and climbed into the car beside him. They arrived at the old waterfront warehouse just after midnight. Lorenzo went inside to meet with his suppliers. Emma waited in the car. And then, the explosion. Flames erupting from the building's south wing, swallowing everything in seconds. Screaming. Smoke. The sickening smell of burning fuel and flesh. Lorenzo had run toward the fire, shouting her name, but his men pulled him back. The car was gone, engulfed. By the time the fire was extinguished, there was nothing left but charred metal and ash. They found a ring, her wedding ring, melted and twisted beyond recognition. The coroner told him the remains were too damaged to identify, but the evidence was clear. Emma Watson was dead. Lorenzo buried that ring in a cemetery on a hill overlooking the ocean. He knelt in the rain and screamed until his voice gave out. And then he stood, walked away, and became something else entirely. But she was not dead. She was alive, selling umbrellas in the rain, with a baby. Lorenzo opened his eyes, his breath uneven, the glass still clenched in his fist. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. The child looked around 4 or 5 years old. Emma had vanished 5 years ago, which meant she had been pregnant. Pregnant when she disappeared, pregnant with his child, and she had never told him. Or worse, she had tried to tell him, and someone had made sure he never found out. The anger hit him like a freight train. Not the explosive, destructive rage he was known for, but something colder, sharper, more dangerous. She did not leave him. She could not have. Emma loved him. She would never have abandoned him, never have hidden a child from him unless someone forced her to. Lorenzo moved to his desk and slammed his hand down on the intercom. His voice came out low and deadly. "Get me Marco, now." Within minutes, his enforcer appeared in the doorway, silent and watchful as always. Marco Salerno was a man of few words and absolute loyalty. The only person in Lorenzo's organization he still trusted without question. "I need everything," Lorenzo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every file, every report, every piece of surveillance from 5 years ago. The warehouse fire, the investigation, Emma's autopsy, all of it." Marco did not ask why. He simply nodded and disappeared. Lorenzo spent the next 2 hours tearing through records, old security logs, incident reports, forensic analysis, and with every page he turned, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. There were gaps, missing footage from the night of the fire, surveillance cameras that had mysteriously malfunctioned, witness statements that contradicted each other, an autopsy report that was vague, incomplete, almost deliberately obscured. Someone had cleaned this. Someone had erased Emma. Someone had made sure Lorenzo believed she was dead. And that someone had access to everything, his security systems, his investigators, his inner circle. Lorenzo stared at the files spread across his desk, his mind racing through names, faces, every lieutenant and advisor who had been close to him 5 years ago. And then one name surfaced, cold and sharp as a blade, pressed against his throat. Giovanni Moretti, his consigliere, his childhood friend. The man who had stood beside him at Emma's funeral, who had gripped his shoulder and whispered, "We'll find who did this. I swear it." Lorenzo's hands curled into fists. Giovanni had been the one to deliver the forensic reports. Giovanni had been the one to oversee the investigation. Giovanni had been the one who convinced him to stop searching, to let Emma rest, to move on. Lorenzo's voice came out as a whisper, lethal and broken. Giovanni, what did you do? The rain pounded against the windows. The city lights flickered below. And Lorenzo Luca, one of the most feared men on the eastern coast, sat alone in the dark, staring at the evidence of a betrayal so deep it had stolen 5 years of his life and the family he never knew he had. Lorenzo did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk as dawn crept across the city, surrounded by ghosts, old emails, voice recordings, handwritten notes from years past, evidence of a friendship he had never questioned, evidence of a betrayal he had been too blind to see. Giovanni Moretti had been part of Lorenzo's life since childhood. They grew up on the same brutal streets, survived the same wars, built the Luca empire together with blood and fire. Giovanni was more than his consigliere. He was his brother in everything but name. The man Lorenzo trusted with his life. The man who had access to everything. Now, as Lorenzo combed through the archives of their communication, patterns began to emerge. Subtle, poisonous, perfectly concealed beneath layers of loyalty and concern. He pulled up an email from 5 years ago, sent 3 days after the warehouse fire. Giovanni's words were careful, measured, soaked in false sympathy. Lorenzo, I know this is unbearable, but we need to consider the possibility that Emma's death was not an accident. The explosion pattern suggests deliberate sabotage. The Rossi family has been pushing into our territory for months. This could be their move. Kill your wife to destabilize you, then strike while you're vulnerable. Let me handle the investigation. You focus on staying strong. At the time, Lorenzo had been grateful that someone else would shoulder the burden of finding answers while he drowned in grief. But now, reading those words again, he saw them for what they truly were: misdirection. Giovanni had pointed him toward the Rossi family, toward external enemies, toward anyone except the truth. And Lorenzo, broken and desperate, had believed him. He scrolled further. Another message. 2 weeks later. The forensic team confirmed it traces of accelerant, remote detonation device. This was a hit. The Rosses are denying involvement, but we both know they're liars. I'm already moving assets into position. We'll make them pay for what they did to Emma. Lorenzo had authorized the retaliation. 3 Rossi lieutenants dead within a month. A bloody, vicious war that lasted half a year and left dozens of bodies in its wake. All based on Giovanni's investigation. All based on a lie? Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his mind replaying every conversation, every briefing, every moment Giovanni had steered him away from the truth. And then he remembered something else. A fleeting comment Giovanni had made during one of their late-night strategy sessions months before Emma's death. They had been drinking whiskey in this same office, reviewing expansion plans, when Giovanni had said, almost casually, "You've changed since you married her, you know." Lorenzo had glanced up. Changed how? Softer. Giovanni swirled his glass, his expression unreadable. You hesitate now. Second-guess yourself. Emma's made you human. And in our world, being human gets you killed. Lorenzo had laughed it off. I'm still standing, aren't I? Giovanni had smiled, but there was something cold behind it. For now, Lorenzo's fists clenched. He saw it now. Giovanni had not wanted a partner, he had wanted control. Emma had been an obstacle, a vulnerability, something that made Lorenzo less ruthless, less predictable, less easy to manipulate. So Giovanni had removed her, staged her death, framed a rival gang, and kept Lorenzo blind with grief and rage while he consolidated power in the shadows. Emma's death was not an accident. It was an execution, and Giovanni had orchestrated everything. Lorenzo pressed the intercom. "Marco, my office. Now." Marco appeared moments later, silent as always, his dark eyes scanning Lorenzo's face. He knew something had shifted. "I need you to find Emma," Lorenzo said. his voice low and lethal. "Every place she's been in the last 5 years. Every alias. Every transaction. Every footprint. I don't care how deep you have to dig. Find her." Marco nodded once. "And Giovanni?" Lorenzo's gaze turned cold. "Watch him, but don't let him know. Not yet." Marco disappeared without another word. That night, Lorenzo left headquarters later than usual. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick with water, reflecting the neon glow of the city like broken glass. His driver navigated through the empty avenues, heading toward Lorenzo's private residence on the outskirts of the city. They were halfway across the bridge when the first shot shattered the rear window. "Get down!" the driver shouted, swerving hard to the right. Lorenzo dropped low as bullets tore through the sedan, punching holes in the reinforced glass, ripping through leather and metal. Two black SUVs flanked them, their windows down, masked men leaning out with automatic weapons. The driver floored the accelerator, weaving through traffic as gunfire erupted around them. Lorenzo pulled his pistol from his shoulder holster, leaned out the window, and fired back. One of the assassins jerked backward, his weapon clattering to the pavement. But more bullets followed, relentless and precise. "They're boxing us in!" the driver yelled. Lorenzo saw it. A third vehicle speeding toward them head-on, trying to force them off the bridge. He made a split-second decision. "Ram through!" The driver obeyed without hesitation, slamming into the oncoming SUV at an angle, sending it spinning into the guardrail. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. Lorenzo's sedan barreled through the wreckage, tires screeching as they raced off the bridge and into the narrow streets beyond. The black SUVs did not follow. They vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only shattered glass and the smell of burning rubber. Lorenzo sat in the back seat, breathing hard, his pistol still hot in his hand. Blood trickled from a shallow cut above his eyebrow where shrapnel had grazed him. The driver glanced back, pale and shaking. "Boss, are you?" "Drive," Lorenzo said quietly. "Just drive." As the city blurred past, Lorenzo stared out at the empty streets, his mind cold and sharp as a blade. The assassins had known his route. They had known his schedule. They had been waiting. Giovanni was not just a traitor. He was still hunting, still trying to finish what he started 5 years ago. The war had begun. And this time, Lorenzo would burn everything Giovanni had built to the ground. Emma Watson had not slept through a full night in 5 years. Even now, in the cramped studio apartment she rented under a false name, she woke every few hours to check the locks, to peer through the blinds at the empty street below, to make sure no shadows moved where they shouldn't. Her son, Luca, she had named him, slept peacefully in the small crib beside her bed, his tiny chest rising and falling in the innocent rhythm of childhood. She watched him in the darkness, her hand resting gently on his back, and wondered how much longer they could keep running. It started 5 years ago, on a night that should have been ordinary. Emma had been 3 months pregnant, though she had not yet told Lorenzo. She wanted to wait, to find the perfect moment, to see his face light up with joy the way it did whenever she surprised him with something meaningful. But that night, she had stayed late at the warehouse office, sorting through charity donation records, when she overheard voices drifting through the thin walls. Giovanni's voice, cold, clinical, final. "She's making him weak. You've seen it. He hesitates now. Questions orders. Emma Watson is a liability, and liabilities in our world don't survive. I want her gone. Tonight." Another voice, one she did not recognize. "The boss won't forgive this. He loves her. He'll grieve. And then he'll remember who he is. A king doesn't bow to sentiment. Do it cleanly. Make it look like an accident. The Rossis can take the blame." Emma's blood turned to ice. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, protecting the life growing inside her. She had to leave. Now. But how? Giovanni controlled everything: security, surveillance, every exit. If she ran, they would find her. If she stayed, she was dead. She slipped out through a side door and ran into the rain. her heart pounding so hard she thought it would tear through her chest. She did not know where to go, who to trust. And then, in the shadows near the loading dock, a hand caught her arm. She nearly screamed. It was Marco Salerno, Lorenzo's enforcer. Silent, deadly, loyal. But his eyes were different that night. Urgent, almost kind. "You heard?" he said quietly. It was not a question. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. Marco glanced over his shoulder, then pulled her deeper into the shadows. "Listen carefully. Giovanni's men are already moving. You have maybe 10 minutes. I can get you out, but you can never come back. Do you understand? Never. Lorenzo." "Lorenzo can't know. If he knows you're alive, he'll search for you, and Giovanni will use that to destroy him. The only way you survive is if everyone believes you're dead." Emma's legs nearly gave out. "How?" Marco handed her a thick envelope. "Cash, fake identification, a burner phone. I'll stage the scene. There's a body in the morgue. Jane Doe. Similar build. I'll make it work. But you have to disappear. Completely. Different name, different life. If you stay, they'll kill you and the child." Emma's hand flew to her stomach again. Marco noticed. "You're pregnant," he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Does Lorenzo know?" She shook her head, sobbing. "Then that baby is your reason to run. Go. Now. I'll give you a 5-minute head start before I set the fire." Emma wanted to argue, to fight, to find another way. But the look in Marco's eyes told her there was no other way. So she ran, out into the storm, away from the only man she had ever loved, away from the life she had built, into the darkness. The years that followed were a blur of fear and survival. Emma moved from town to town, never staying longer than a few months, always looking over her shoulder. She worked as a waitress in diners where no one asked questions, as a housekeeper in motels that paid under the table, as a street vendor selling whatever she could carry. She gave birth to Luca alone in a rundown clinic, biting down on a towel to muffle her screams, terrified that someone would recognize her, that Giovanni's men would find her even there. But Luca was born healthy, with his father's sapphire blue eyes, and Emma held him and wept for joy, for grief, for the life her son would never know. She told herself stories to survive. She told herself that Lorenzo had moved on, that he had found someone new, that he had forgotten her. Because the alternative that he still mourned her, that he believed she was dead, was too painful to bear. And beneath that pain was a darker fear. What if Lorenzo blamed her for running? What if he thought she had abandoned him, betrayed him? What if he discovered she had kept his child from him? Emma had heard the stories. She knew what Lorenzo Luca did to people who crossed him. And in her darkest moments, she believed that if he ever found her, he would see her survival as a betrayal. He would take Luca. He would destroy her. So she kept running. Now, 5 years later, Emma stood on rain-soaked sidewalks, selling umbrellas to strangers, her son strapped to her chest, her hands raw from cold. She smiled at customers, made small talk, counted her coins at the end of each night. It was barely enough, but it was survival. She did not know that Lorenzo still grieved her, did not know that he had buried a ring and screamed her name into the rain, did not know that Giovanni had lied to him, manipulated him, turned him into a weapon against ghosts. All Emma knew was that the man she loved had never come for her, and so she assumed he never would. She kissed Luca's forehead as he slept, whispering the same prayer she whispered every night. "Stay safe, my love. Stay hidden. Just a little longer." But the storm was already closing in. The rain returned that night, heavier than before, drumming against the cracked pavement of the narrow street where Emma's apartment building stood. It was a forgotten corner of the city, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Broken streetlights, graffiti-stained walls, windows covered with sheets instead of curtains. Lorenzo stood in the shadows across the street, staring up at the third-floor window where a single dim light glowed. Marco had found her. It had taken 2 days of tracing aliases, old transactions, surveillance footage from bus stations and corner stores. But Marco had found her. And now Lorenzo was here, and he had no idea what he was going to say. His hand moved to the door of the building, hesitated, then pushed it open. The hinges groaned. The stairwell smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. He climbed slowly, each step heavier than the last, until he stood outside apartment 3C. He could hear the faint sound of a baby crying inside. Then a soft voice, her voice soothing him back to sleep. Lorenzo raised his fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Inside, everything went silent. He knocked again. "Emma!" He heard movement. Footsteps. Then, nothing. She was standing on the other side of the door. He knew it. Frozen. Terrified. He waited. His breath shallow. His heart pounding harder than it had during the ambush 2 nights ago. Finally, the lock turned. The door opened a crack, the chain still fastened. And there she was. Emma. Her face was thinner than he remembered, pale and exhausted, her eyes shadowed with years of fear. But it was her. Unmistakably her. She stared at him through the gap in the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, two people who had been ripped apart by lies, standing face to face for the first time in 5 years. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Let me in," he said quietly. Her hands trembled on the chain. She did not move. "How did you find me?" "Does it matter?" "Yes." Her eyes filled with tears. "Because if you found me, then they can too." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Who's they, Emma?" She shook her head, stepping back. "You need to leave. You can't be here. They'll kill us both." "Open the door." "Lorenzo." "Open it, now." Something in his voice, desperation, not anger, made her hesitate. Slowly, she unhooked the chain and opened the door. Lorenzo stepped inside, and the small apartment seemed to shrink around him. It was barely a room. A mattress on the floor, a crib in the corner, a hot plate on a plastic table. This was where she had been living, where she had raised his son. Emma backed away. Instinctively moving toward the crib where Luca slept, she picked him up, holding him against her chest like a shield. The baby stirred but did not wake. Lorenzo stared at them both, at Emma, fragile and fierce, and at the child who had his eyes, his son. "Why didn't you come back to me?" The words came out broken, raw, barely above a whisper. Emma's face crumpled. "Come back to you? Lorenzo, they told me you ordered my death." Lorenzo froze. "What?" "That night, 5 years ago, I heard Giovanni. He said I was making you weak, that I was a liability, that you wanted me gone. He said it was your order." "That's a lie." "I didn't know that." Emma's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "Marco got me out. He told me if I stayed, they would kill me and the baby. I thought you knew. I thought you wanted me dead because I was ruining your empire. And when you never came for me, I assumed," she choked on a sob, "I assumed you had moved on." Lorenzo felt like he had been shot. The pain was physical, searing through his chest. "I buried you, Emma. I knelt at your grave and screamed your name until I had no voice left. I mourned you every single day for 5 years. I never moved on. I never let you go." Emma stared at him, her entire body shaking. "You didn't know? Giovanni lied to me. He staged your death, framed a rival gang, made me believe you were gone. And I," his voice broke, "I tore this city apart trying to avenge you. I became a monster because I thought you were dead." The truth settled between them like shattered glass. All the years of pain, all the lies, all the time they had lost. Emma sank onto the edge of the mattress, sobbing, still holding Luca against her chest. Lorenzo moved toward her slowly, carefully, as if she might vanish if he moved too fast. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering near hers, afraid to touch her, afraid this was another cruel dream. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered. Emma looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "I never stopped loving you either." And then, without thinking, without hesitation, Lorenzo reached out and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs, and he held her like he had been holding his breath for 5 years and could finally breathe again. Luca stirred between them, his small eyes blinking open. He looked up at Lorenzo with those familiar sapphire blue eyes, confused but unafraid. Lorenzo stared down at his son, and something inside him broke wide open. "Can I?" his voice caught. "Can I hold him?" Emma nodded, tears still streaming down her face. She carefully placed Luca in Lorenzo's arms. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile. Lorenzo held him like he was made of glass, his large, scarred hands trembling as he touched his son's cheek for the first time. "He has your eyes," Emma whispered. Lorenzo's throat tightened. "He has yours too." For one perfect, fragile moment, the world stopped. The rain, the fear, the years of lies and grief, all of it faded. There was only this: Emma, Lorenzo, and the child they had made together. And then the window exploded. Glass shattered inward as a bullet tore through the room, slamming into the wall inches from where they sat. Emma screamed. Lorenzo threw himself over her and the baby, shielding them with his body as gunfire erupted from the street below. "Get down!" he shouted, pulling them toward the floor. More bullets punched through the walls, ripping apart the thin plaster, splintering wood. The assassins had found them, and this time they were not aiming to miss. Lorenzo kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his pistol as the black SUV tore through the rain-slicked mountain roads. Emma sat in the back seat. Luca clutched against her chest, her eyes wide and wild with fear. Every time the baby whimpered, she whispered soothing words, but her voice shook with adrenaline. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Lorenzo said, though he was not sure anywhere was safe anymore. They had escaped the apartment building through a fire exit, Marco appearing out of nowhere to cover their retreat, his pistol barking into the darkness as assassins poured out of black vans below. 3 bodies had dropped before Lorenzo dragged Emma into the alley, and Marco had peeled away in a second vehicle to draw the pursuit away from them. Now they were alone on a winding mountain road, heading toward a cabin Lorenzo had kept off the books for years, a safe house known only to him. No records, no trails. A place where he could think, regroup, and plan his next move. The cabin appeared through the trees an hour later, a small structure of wood and stone perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a valley swallowed by darkness. Lorenzo pulled the SUV into the shelter of the trees and killed the engine. Silence pressed in around them, broken only by the steady patter of rain on the roof. "Stay close to me," he said, scanning the tree line before opening the door. Emma followed him inside, holding Luca tightly. The cabin was cold and sparse, 2 rooms, a fireplace, boarded windows. Lorenzo moved through it quickly, checking every corner, every shadow. Clear. For now. He locked the door and pulled Emma toward the back room. "You and Luca stay here. If anything happens, there's a crawl space under the floorboards. You hide there, and you don't come out until I say so. Understand?" Emma nodded, her face pale. "Lorenzo, I won't let them touch you again." His voice was steel. "Not ever." Marco arrived 30 minutes later, slipping through the back door like a ghost. Blood streaked his jacket, but his expression was calm, unreadable as always. "They followed you?" Lorenzo asked. "I lost them, but they know we're in this area. It's only a matter of time." Lorenzo cursed under his breath. "How many?" "At least a dozen, maybe more. Giovanni's throwing everything at us." Emma appeared in the doorway, Luca asleep in her arms. "Why is he doing this? Why now?" Lorenzo turned to her, his jaw tight. "Because you're alive. Because you're proof that he lied. If I take you back to the city, if people see you, Giovanni's empire crumbles. He has to kill us all before that happens." Emma's face went white. Marco glanced at Lorenzo, his expression grim. "We should fortify. They'll come tonight." They spent the next hour preparing. Marco rigged tripwires along the perimeter. Lorenzo boarded the windows with furniture, loaded every weapon they had, and positioned ammunition caches around the cabin. Emma stayed in the back room with Luca, a pistol on the floor beside her, though her hands shook every time she looked at it. And then they waited. The attack came just after midnight. No warning, no engine noise, just the sharp crack of a tripwire snapping, followed by the deafening roar of automatic gunfire tearing through the cabin walls. Glass exploded inward, wood splintered. Smoke grenades tumbled through the shattered windows, filling the room with choking white fog. "Emma, get down!" Lorenzo shouted, firing blindly into the smoke as shadows moved outside. Marco was already at the side window, dropping 2 men before they could breach the door. More gunfire. The front door buckled under the impact of a battering ram, then exploded inward. 3 masked men rushed through, weapons raised. Lorenzo met them head-on, no time to reload. He slammed his pistol into the first man's face, crushed the second's windpipe with his elbow, and drove the third into the wall with enough force to crack bone. But more were coming. Always more. "Marco!" Lorenzo roared. "Back exits compromised." Marco fired through the rear window, cutting down another wave of attackers. "We're surrounded." Lorenzo's mind raced. They could not hold this position. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the smoke was suffocating. He turned toward the back room where Emma was hiding with Luca. "Emma! We're moving, now!" She stumbled out of the room, coughing, Luca screaming in her arms. Lorenzo grabbed her and pulled her toward the kitchen. Marco was already ripping up the floorboards, revealing a narrow crawl space that led to a concealed exit beneath the cabin. "Go!" Marco shouted. "I'll cover you." Lorenzo shoved Emma down into the crawl space first, Luca still wailing, then dropped in after her. The space was tight, suffocating, barely wide enough to move through. He could hear Marco above them, his pistol barking rhythmically, buying them seconds. They crawled through mud and darkness, Emma sobbing, Luca's cries echoing off the wooden beams above. Lorenzo's lungs burned. His hands bled. But he kept moving, dragging them forward until they reached the exit, a narrow hatch that opened into the forest behind the cabin. Lorenzo kicked it open and pulled Emma out into the rain. She collapsed onto the wet ground, clutching Luca, gasping for air. Lorenzo turned back toward the cabin just as Marco dove through the hatch, his jacket smoking. "Run!" Marco shouted. They ran. Behind them, the cabin erupted in a massive fireball, the explosion ripping through the night like thunder. Flames roared into the sky, consuming everything. Lorenzo shielded Emma and the baby from the blast, the heat searing his back. They did not stop running until they were deep into the trees, the glow of the burning cabin fading behind them. Lorenzo collapsed against a tree, his breath ragged, his body screaming with exhaustion. Emma sank to the ground beside him, rocking Luca, who had finally stopped crying. Marco leaned against a boulder, blood dripping from a gash above his eye. That was too close. Lorenzo's hands curled into fists. His voice came out low, lethal, shaking with rage. "Giovanni dies. I don't care how many men he has. I don't care what it costs. I end this." Emma looked up at him, tears streaking her dirt-covered face. "Lorenzo, he tried to kill you twice. He stole 5 years of our lives. He tried to murder our son." Lorenzo's voice broke. "I will burn everything he's built to the ground, and then I will kill him myself." The rain poured down. The forest was silent except for their breathing. And somewhere in the darkness, the war had truly begun. 3 days after the cabin burned, Lorenzo stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse on the city's industrial edge. The building had once been part of his empire, a distribution hub for imported goods, both legal and otherwise. But records showed it had been decommissioned 2 years ago, demolished and sold off. Except it had not been demolished. It had been repurposed. Marco had discovered the discrepancy buried in old financial records payments, continuing long after the warehouse was officially closed, routing through shell companies that all traced back to one name, Giovanni Moretti. Now Lorenzo moved through the darkness with Marco at his side, their footsteps silent on the concrete floor. Emma and Luca were hidden in a secure location across the city, guarded by the only 3 men Lorenzo still trusted with his life. He would not risk them again. Not until Giovanni was dead. The warehouse was not empty. As they descended into the lower levels, evidence of recent activity became clear. Tire tracks in the dust. The smell of cigarette smoke. And then, behind a false wall Marco pried open with a crowbar, they found it. A room? No, a command center. Computers lined one wall, their screens dark but still warm. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows. A large table dominated the center of the room, covered in maps, photographs, and documents. And on the wall, written in black marker like a mission statement, were 3 words that made Lorenzo's blood run cold. The reforging protocol. Lorenzo moved closer, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. Marco opened the filing cabinets methodically, pulling out folders, spreading them across the table. What they found was not just evidence of betrayal. It was a blueprint for total annihilation. The first folder contained financial records, hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. Millions of dollars siphoned from Lorenzo's operations over the course of 5 years. Money that should have been reinvested into the empire, instead funneled into Giovanni's private war chest. The second folder was worse. Plans to overthrow Lorenzo. Not quickly, not violently, but slowly, methodically, by undermining every pillar of his power. Lists of lieutenants Giovanni had turned. Judges and police captains he had bought. Rival gangs he had secretly allied with. A web of corruption so vast and intricate that Lorenzo realized with sickening clarity Giovanni had been building a shadow empire for years. But it was the third folder that shattered him. Subject: Emma Watson. Elimination and contingency. Lorenzo's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were surveillance photos of Emma. Dozens of them. Some from 5 years ago, before the warehouse fire. Others, more recent, Emma in different cities, selling flowers, working in diners, always with Luca. Giovanni had been watching her, tracking her, waiting. There were detailed reports on her movements, her aliases, the places she lived, and worse notes on Luca, his age, his appearance, the undeniable resemblance to Lorenzo. Giovanni had known. He had known Emma was alive. He had known about the child, and he had done nothing because he was waiting for the right moment to eliminate them both. Marco's voice was flat, emotionless. He's been hunting her for 5 years. Lorenzo could not speak. He turned to the wall where the manifesto hung, a typed document pinned above the table like a declaration of war. The reforging protocol. Phase 1. Eliminate the weakness. Emma Watson represents a critical vulnerability in Lorenzo Luca's leadership. Her influence makes him hesitant, compassionate, and ultimately unfit to rule. Elimination was necessary. Staging her death ensures Lorenzo's grief transforms into rage, redirecting his focus toward external enemies, while consolidating my control over internal operations. Phase 2. Rebuild the foundation. Over the course of 5 years, gradually shift loyalty from Lorenzo to myself. Turn key lieutenants, secure financial independence, establish alliances with rival organizations. When the time comes, Lorenzo's empire will already be mine in everything but name. Phase 3. Discovery and escalation. If Emma Watson resurfaces, she becomes the catalyst. Her survival exposes the lie. Lorenzo will fracture emotionally, making him vulnerable. Assassinate Emma and the child. Frame Lorenzo for multiple murders, including the deaths of his own loyalists. His credibility collapses. His empire crumbles. Phase 4. The final move. With Lorenzo isolated, broken, and hunted by law enforcement, eliminate him. Claim the Luca Empire as my own. Rebrand. Restructure. Rule without the weaknesses of sentiment or mercy. The reforging is not a coup. It is an evolution. The Luca Empire will be reborn in my image. Stronger, colder, unbreakable. Lorenzo read the words twice, then a third time. The room seemed to tilt around him, the walls closing in. Giovanni had not acted out of jealousy or ambition alone. He had planned this. Every step, every lie, every death. For 5 years, Giovanni had been orchestrating Lorenzo's destruction with surgical precision. And Lorenzo had trusted him, called him brother, given him access to everything. Marco's voice cut through the silence. There's more. He handed Lorenzo another file. Inside were forged documents evidence Giovanni had fabricated to frame Lorenzo for money laundering, murder, and trafficking. Police reports waiting to be leaked, testimonies from paid witnesses, even falsified communications made to look like Lorenzo's orders. If Giovanni succeeded, Lorenzo would not just lose his empire, he would lose his freedom, his life, everything. He's been planning this since the beginning, Marco said quietly. Maybe even before he killed Emma. Lorenzo's fists clenched. He didn't kill her, he failed. And now he's desperate. Which makes him more dangerous. Lorenzo turned away from the manifesto, his mind cold and sharp as a blade. Giovanni had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated how far Lorenzo would go to protect the people he loved. Giovanni thought Emma's return would break him. But it had done the opposite. Lorenzo looked at Marco, his voice low and deadly. Find every warehouse, every safe house, every account, every person Giovanni turned. I want a list of every piece of his shadow empire. And then, we burn it all. Lorenzo's eyes were dark, merciless. Every asset, every ally, every lie he built. I want Giovanni to watch everything he created turn to ash. And then, he paused, his jaw tight. Then I kill him myself. Marco nodded once and disappeared into the shadows to begin the hunt. Lorenzo stood alone in the command center, staring at the manifesto on the wall. Giovanni had called it the reforging, a rebirth of the empire. But the only thing that would be reforged now was Lorenzo himself. And Giovanni would not survive it. The cathedral basement had not been used for worship in decades. It sat beneath an abandoned church on the city's east side, forgotten by everyone except those who knew where to look. Giovanni Moretti had chosen it deliberately. Gothic arches carved from stone, shadows deep enough to drown in, and acoustics that turned every whisper into an echo. A throne room for a man who believed himself a king. Lorenzo descended the stone steps with Marco at his side, their footsteps ringing through the darkness. The air was cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and old incense. Candles flickered along the walls, casting wavering shadows across the vaulted ceiling. And there, at the far end of the chamber, standing before an altar draped in black cloth, was Giovanni Moretti. He turned slowly, as if he had been expecting them. His suit was immaculate, his expression calm, almost serene. In his hand, he held a pistol, but it hung loosely at his side, unthreatening. Behind him, 6 armed men emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on Lorenzo and Marco. Lorenzo! Giovanni's voice echoed through the chamber, smooth and cold. I wondered how long it would take you to find me. Lorenzo stopped 10 feet from the altar, his own weapon drawn but not yet raised. Marco moved to his left, covering the flanks, his eyes scanning for threats. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every breath measured, every heartbeat counted. Call off your men, Lorenzo said quietly. This is between us. Giovanni smiled, a thin, joyless expression. You still don't understand, do you? There is no between us. There never was. You were always just a placeholder, Lorenzo. A means to an end. And now that end has come. You murdered my wife. You tried to kill my son. I removed obstacles. Giovanni's tone remained conversational, as if discussing business over dinner. Emma made you weak, sentimental, distracted. She turned you into something this empire could not afford. A man with a conscience. I did what was necessary to preserve what we built. What I built. Lorenzo's voice was steel. You were nothing before me, a street thug with delusions of grandeur. I gave you power. I trusted you. I called you brother. Giovanni's smile faded. And that trust made you blind. You never saw it, did you? How every decision you made, I guided. Every enemy you destroyed, I chose. Every alliance you forged, I orchestrated. You thought you were king, but you were just the face. I was always the hand that moved the pieces." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Then you made a mistake. Because the face is what people follow. And when I tell them what you've done, your empire crumbles." "My empire?" Giovanni laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Lorenzo, look around. These men don't follow you. Half your lieutenants answer to me. Your supply lines run through my contacts. Your finances flow through my accounts. I've spent 5 years hollowing you out from the inside. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet. Then why am I still standing?" Giovanni's expression darkened. "Because I wanted to see your face when you realized how completely you'd lost. I wanted you to understand that everything you love, Emma, that bastard child, the empire you think is yours, it all belongs to me now, and I can take it whenever I choose." Lorenzo's hand tightened on his pistol. "You won't touch them again." "I already have." Giovanni raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Lorenzo's chest. "Emma should have stayed hidden. The child should have never been born. And you should have died with her 5 years ago. But don't worry, I'll finish what I started. And when you're gone, I'll make sure Emma and the boy follow shortly after. Clean. Final. No loose ends." The words hit Lorenzo like a physical blow. But beneath the rage, beneath the pain, something colder settled into place. A clarity he had not felt since the night he saw Emma in the rain. Giovanni had made his final mistake. He had revealed everything, and now there was nothing left to negotiate. "Marco," Lorenzo said quietly. Marco moved before Giovanni's men could react. He fired twice, dropping the 2 guards closest to the altar. Chaos erupted. Giovanni's remaining men opened fire, bullets screaming through the chamber, ricocheting off stone, shattering candles. Lorenzo dove behind a stone pillar, returning fire, his shots precise and lethal. 2 more guards fell. Giovanni scrambled toward the back of the chamber, firing wildly over his shoulder. Lorenzo pursued, his movements cold and methodical, every step deliberate. Marco covered him, taking down the last guard with a shot to the head before collapsing against the altar, blood spreading across his shoulder. "Marco!" Lorenzo turned, but Marco waved him off. "Go," Marco rasped. "Finish it." Lorenzo did not hesitate. He ran after Giovanni, following him through a narrow passageway that led deeper into the catacombs beneath the church. The walls closed in, the air growing colder, the darkness thickening. And then the passage opened into a circular chamber, empty except for a single shaft of pale light filtering down from a grate above. Giovanni stood in the center, his pistol raised, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His suit was torn, his face streaked with sweat and grime. The calm mask he had worn was gone, replaced by something wild and desperate. "You can't win," Giovanni said, his voice shaking. "Even if you kill me, my network survives. My alliances hold. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next assassin, the next betrayal. You'll never be safe. Emma will never be safe. That child will never be safe." Lorenzo stepped into the light, his weapon steady, his eyes dark and merciless. "Then I'll burn it all. Every warehouse, every contact, every lie you built. I'll tear your empire apart piece by piece until there's nothing left but ash. And then I'll make sure everyone knows what you did, how you murdered an innocent woman, how you tried to kill a child, how you betrayed the man who gave you everything." Giovanni's hand trembled. "She made you weak." "No." Lorenzo's voice was quiet, final. "She made me human, and that's something you'll never understand." Giovanni fired. The shot went wide, panic ruining his aim. Lorenzo did not flinch. He raised his pistol, aimed at Giovanni's heart, and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the catacombs like thunder. Giovanni staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, his hand clutching the wound in his chest. Blood spread across his white shirt, dark and final. He fell to his knees, his pistol clattering to the stone floor. "You were always too sentimental," Giovanni whispered, his voice fading. "It'll kill you. One day." Lorenzo stood over him, his expression cold and empty. "Today it killed you." Giovanni's eyes went dark. His body slumped forward, lifeless. The man who had orchestrated 5 years of lies and suffering, finally silenced. Lorenzo stared down at him for a long moment, feeling nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Only the hollow certainty that it was over. He turned and walked back through the passage, back to where Marco sat, slumped against the altar, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. Marco looked up, his expression grim but steady. "It's done," Lorenzo said. Marco nodded. "Then let's go home." The next 3 weeks were a storm of fire and reckoning. Lorenzo moved through Giovanni's shadow empire like a blade through silk, methodical and merciless. Every warehouse Giovanni had hidden was burned. Every account he had siphoned was seized and redistributed. Every lieutenant he had turned was given a choice: pledge loyalty to Lorenzo or disappear. Most chose loyalty. The few who did not were never seen again. The underworld whispered about the purge, about how Lorenzo Luca had risen from the ashes of betrayal and reclaimed his empire with a brutality that made even his enemies respect him. But those who looked closely saw something else. Saw the way Lorenzo delegated more to Marco and his remaining trusted men. Saw the way he spent less time in the marble towers of his headquarters and more time away, unreachable, untraceable. Because Lorenzo was no longer building an empire for himself, he was securing it for the family he had nearly lost. Emma and Luca remained hidden throughout the purge, protected in a secure location known only to Marco. Lorenzo visited them when he could, slipping through the city under cover of darkness, always watching for threats that no longer existed. Each time he arrived, Emma would open the door and pull him inside, her eyes searching his face for signs of injury, for confirmation that he was still alive. And each time, Luca would run to him, small arms outstretched, shouting, "Papa!" in a voice that shattered and remade Lorenzo with every syllable. It was in those moments, holding his son, feeling Emma's hand in his, that Lorenzo understood what Giovanni had never grasped. Strength was not the absence of vulnerability. It was the willingness to protect what you loved, no matter the cost. 1 month after Giovanni's death, Lorenzo returned to the safe house for the last time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Emma stood at the window, watching the horizon. Luca, asleep in her arms. She turned when Lorenzo entered, and the question in her eyes was clear. "It's over," Lorenzo said quietly. "Giovanni's network is gone. Every threat, every loose end. You're safe now." Emma's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" Lorenzo crossed the room and knelt before her, his hands resting gently on hers where they cradled Luca. "I'm sure. No one will ever take you from me again. I swear it." Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I thought I'd lost you. For 5 years. I thought—" "I know," Lorenzo's voice broke. "But we're here now. All of us. And I'm not letting go." He lifted Luca carefully from Emma's arms and held him against his chest. The boy stirred, his sapphire eyes blinking open, and Lorenzo smiled. A real smile. The kind he had not worn in years. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "We're going home." They left the city 3 days later. Not permanently, but long enough to breathe. Lorenzo had purchased a house on the coast, far from the empire's reach, a place where the sound of waves replaced gunfire and the air smelled of salt instead of smoke. It was modest by his standards. White walls, wide windows, a porch that overlooked the ocean. But it was theirs. Emma stood on the porch that first morning, Luca playing in the sand below, and felt something she had not felt in 5 years. Peace. Lorenzo came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back against him, closing her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For finding me. For fighting for us. For not giving up." Lorenzo pressed a kiss to her hair. "I never stopped looking for you. Even when I thought you were gone, I never let you go. Emma turned in his arms, her hands framing his face. I love you. I never stopped. Not for a single day. I love you too. Lorenzo's voice was rough, raw with emotion. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost. They kissed, slow and deep. The kind of kiss that held 5 years of grief, longing, and unspoken promises. And when they pulled apart, they simply stood there, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync. Below them, Luca shrieked with laughter, chasing seagulls across the sand. Lorenzo watched him, and something in his chest expanded, too large to contain. He has your laugh, Emma said softly. He has your stubbornness. Emma smiled. Good. He'll need it with you as a father. Lorenzo laughed, a sound that came easier now, and pulled her closer. They stayed like that for a long time, watching their son play, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. The empire still existed. The underworld still turned. But for now, in this moment, none of it mattered. 6 months later, Lorenzo stood in his office at headquarters, staring out at the city he had bled for. Marco entered quietly, a folder in hand. The last of Giovanni's contacts have been neutralized, Marco said. The Rossi family sent a peace offering. They want to meet. Lorenzo nodded. Set it up, but keep it formal. I'm not interested in expansion right now. Marco studied him. You're pulling back. I'm prioritizing. Lorenzo turned from the window. Emma and Luca come first. Always. The empire runs itself well enough without me micromanaging every move. You and the lieutenants handle operations. I'll step in when necessary. But my family, his voice hardened. My family is not negotiable. Marco's expression softened. Something rare for him. She's good for you. The boy, too. They're everything. Marco nodded and left. Lorenzo returned to the window, watching the city lights flicker on as night fell. His phone buzzed. A message from Emma. Luca's asking when you're coming home. Hurry up, boss. Lorenzo smiled and pocketed the phone. He grabbed his jacket, turned off the lights, and walked out of the office. The empire could wait. That night, Lorenzo arrived home to find the house glowing with warmth. Emma had cooked dinner. Something simple, pasta and bread. Nothing like the elaborate meals he used to have prepared by private chefs. But it tasted better than anything he had eaten in years. Luca sat in his lap, smearing tomato sauce across Lorenzo's shirt, babbling about the sandcastle he had built that afternoon. Emma watched them from across the table, her eyes soft, her smile brighter than any light in the room. After dinner, they put Luca to bed together. Lorenzo read him a story about knights and dragons, doing ridiculous voices that made the boy giggle uncontrollably. Emma leaned against the doorway, watching, her heart so full it ached. When Luca finally fell asleep, Lorenzo kissed his forehead and whispered, I love you, little man. He stood and found Emma waiting in the hallway. She took his hand and led him outside, onto the porch, where the ocean stretched black and infinite under the stars. They sat on the steps, Emma's head on Lorenzo's shoulder, his arm around her waist. Do you ever regret it? Emma asked quietly. Walking away from the empire? I didn't walk away. I just stopped letting it own me. Lorenzo kissed the top of her head. Giovanni was right about one thing. You did change me, but not the way he thought. You didn't make me weak. You reminded me what I was fighting for. Emma looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. What's that? This. Lorenzo gestured to the house, the ocean, the life they were building. A reason to come home. A reason to be more than just a name people fear. You and Luca. You're my reason. Emma kissed him, slow and tender. And when they pulled apart, she whispered, no one will ever take us from you again. No, Lorenzo agreed, his voice fierce and certain. They won't. They sat there as the waves crashed below, the stars burning overhead. And for the first time in 5 years, Lorenzo Luca felt whole. The ghosts were gone. The lies were buried. And the man who had lived in darkness had finally found his way back to the light. Not because the war was over, but because he had someone worth fighting for. And that made all the difference.